I have a few things to say about Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Now, to his critics, he says, "Vafanculo," as he did coming out of a Catholic church recently to a reporter who questioned him about his influence from Catholic religion. But I say, let's impeach this guy. Now, after the McCarthy-era anti-communist campaigns of the 1950s were finally rejected as witch hunts, ultra-conservative extremists organized the John Birch Society. Now, the society promoted an armed citizen police force who made assassination lists of suspected communist or socialist sympathizers in their hometowns. Their plan was to kill all these people when the revolution came. Their other big campaign was to impeach Chief Justice Earl Warren of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the Warren Court was guided by the judicial philosophy of a living constitution whose intent was revealed not only in the original language, but through its later amendments, such as freeing slaves and giving women the vote. Opponents of the Warren Court advocated ultra-conservative originalism, which was somewhat analogous to the static literal interpretation of Scripture favored by racists, anti-feminists, and anti-evolutionists. Now, Warren was unimpeachable because he was an honest and good-willed judge who did not corrupt the court with partisan politics, regardless of the accusations made that he was tainting all interpretation with liberal political principles. But this guy is not unimpeachable. Judge Scalia, in fact, may very well be impeachable for a determined congressional majority. Is arrogance an impeachable offense? No. But a clear pattern of political partisanship and abuse of judicial power is an impeachable offense. Now, the Reagan-Bush Supreme Court conservative 5-4 voting bloc dynamic goes like this. George W. Bush appointed Clarence Thomas, who is an originalist, Samuel Alito, and John Roberts, who is the least senior member, but he's the Chief Justice. Reagan appointed Anthony Kennedy, who's the swing voter. He's the guy that has to be convinced by the other conservatives, but generally votes with the conservatives. And Antonin Scalia, who is an originalist and a very loud-voiced originalist and quite a character as well. Now, Scalia's originalist judicial philosophy has a dark side. For example, he has defiantly declared, "Mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence properly reached." Well, would the framers of the Constitution agree with this legal philosophy, which sounds more like the cruelties of Mad King George than benevolent George Washington? No, I think not. But these are the kind of absurdities that this judicial philosophy leads to. It's heartless, and it is ultimately cruel and lacks any kind of soul. Now, Scalia has been accused many, many times of being partisan and having an agenda. To quote his wisdom, he says, "I assure you I have no agenda. I am a law and order guy. I mean, I confess to being a social conservative, but it does not affect my views on cases." But he does have an agenda. Let's look at the evidence of his words and his actions. This week, the 5-4 conservative majority of the U.S. Supreme Court aggressively overturned all previous election reform decisions. By aggressively, I mean this. It didn't have to even hear the case, and it certainly didn't need to overturn previous Supreme Court decisions about election reform. But it did. It chose to do that. Now, terrorists could not have more effectively silenced democratic government. Giant oil, pharmaceutical, and other wealthy corporations that already command huge lobbies in Washington can now spend unlimited funds supporting or defeating political candidates who refuse to knuckle under and put the interests of big money ahead of what is best for the nation and the people. And that is bad for the Republic. That is bad for us. This monstrous decision was based on Scalia's relentless advocacy of an originalist First Amendment interpretation. Basically, this philosophy has turned the country over to the wealthy. So Scalia says, and I'm quoting, "In law school, I never understood antitrust law. I later found out in reading the writings of those who now do understand it that I should not have understood it because it did not make any sense then." Now, this is the way it appears also to Republicans in big business. Rather, the antitrust laws went away, but the Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted in order to protect the American Republic from being controlled by a small oligarchy of the super wealthy. And the super wealthy would like to see it go away. Now, this is not the first time Scalia's influence on the Supreme Court has corrupted the political process with a partisan decision. The court intervened to end the vote count in the Gore versus Bush case, essentially declaring Bush the winner in the first election that we had, and Bush became president of the United States, and we know what all ensued after that. The lead advocate for that intervention was Scalia, who would later, and hypocritically, denounce judicial activism. Now, in this little satire, the 5 clowns are the Republican-appointed conservatives who voted as a bloc to end the count and thus assured that George Bush would be brought in as president, and many people say stole the election. So regarding the decision that the Supreme Court made to stop the voting in Florida, he said, well, Gore would have lost anyway. Now, Scalia accused the Florida State Supreme Court justice of being politically motivated, which is kind of hypocritical. And he said that Gore would have lost anyway. Now, these are not impartial comments. The important point is that no one will ever know who would have won if all the votes had been counted. The Supreme Court ordered the vote counting stopped before the count had been properly tallied, and that made Bush president. The 5-4 Supreme Court ruling was classic Scalia partisan philosophy. So whose votes count more than 52% of America? The 5 conservatives, led by Scalia's philosophy, on the Supreme Court. So who needs the military when you can stage a judicial coup? Now, Scalia's outspoken social conservatism has made him a hero and a buddy of powerful Republican politicians like Dick Cheney and the gun lobbies. Here he is appearing as keynote speaker for an international sport shooting gun lobby meeting in Germany. Now, here's what I think is impeachable. A lawsuit against Vice President Dick Cheney sought to learn the identity of members of a secret energy task force he met with early in President Bush's first term. The critics had long suspected that those meetings were a forum for oil companies to directly shape and influence the administration's energy policies for their corporate self-interest. Now, shortly before the case was argued, Scalia went on a hunting trip with Vice President Dick Cheney, who was an old buddy. The two men flew down to Louisiana together on Air Force Two and went duck hunting. Now, the Sierra Club and parties to the suit filed a motion asking Justice Scalia to recuse himself. That means to remove himself from any vote because he had clearly an interest in one of the parties. So he was asked to recuse himself from Cheney's case, which any judge would normally do. But Justice Scalia refused and then voted in Mr. Cheney's favor, and that destroyed public trust in the impartiality of the U.S. Supreme Court. What did Scalia have to say? For Pete's sake, if you can't trust your Supreme Court justice more than that, get a life. Everybody had a field day with this. Scalia's in the pocket of Cheney. Fix just one election and it's all recuse yourself, recuse yourself. But there's one thing Scalia says I like. He says, among the questions considered non-justiciable, that means it can't be decided by the Supreme Court, is the definition of an impeachable offense. Whatever Congress says is an impeachable offense is an impeachable offense. Great. So Congress, it's time to impeach Scalia and replace him with an Obama appointee. There are fertile grounds for impeachment.